We invite you to listen to the discussions recorded during the Warsaw European Conversation, an annual conference by Polityka Insight and the European Council on Foreign Relations. In 5 episodes, we discuss Europe's readiness for war, digital sovereignty, the competitiveness of the EU economies, European elections, and energy policy. In the margins of the European Warsaw Conversation's closing debate on derisking European energy policy, Bruegel's Grabbe and ECFR's Byford TSANG offered their takes on the factors driving energy policy in Brussels and China. As Europe is trying to navigate crises that range from short-term fossil fuels price spikes to long-term competitiveness, we sat down to discuss further. The podcast is hosted by Julia Cydejko, Senior Analyst for Energy Sector at Polityka Insight. Enjoy the episode.
This is the Warsaw European Conversation, and I'm joined by Ms. Grabbe, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. It's a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
We are recording this just about 1 month into the war in the Middle East. I wanted to pick your brains on the impact that this war will have on Europe's energy policy, energy and climate policy. Is this another wake-up call for Europe when it comes to the energy transition, or is it a sign that just fossil fuels are harder to get, but we still need them?
This is a very important second wake-up call for Europe, pointing out that it's a huge strategic vulnerability and weakness of the European continent to remain so dependent on fossil fuels. We have to import nearly all of them now. They're becoming more and more expensive, and prices are extremely volatile. We can't win in this situation, because even if the crisis in the Middle East comes to an end sooner rather than later, prices will remain high because of the damage to production facilities that's already there in the Middle East. And we don't have domestic sources to draw on. Coal is now super expensive, as well as it causes all kinds of problems like air pollution, as well as carbon emissions. So in Europe, we really don't have the luxury of choice in how to deal with the crisis. We have to get out of fossil fuels. At the moment, our electricity prices, it depends on which country, but they are usually driven in many countries by the gas price because of the way that marginal pricing works. So this means that European countries are affected by the crisis in the Middle East to very different extents. For example, Spain, which after 2022 invested very heavily in renewable energy, is much less affected than Italy, which did not. So Spain now, for example, is only facing prices for electricity in megawatt hours of €66, which is half of the price in Italy, because in Italy, gas sets the price nearly 90% of the time, whereas Spain, it only sets it 15% of the time. That makes a huge difference in terms of competitiveness and in terms of household as well as industrial electricity bills.
And through Prime Minister Meloni, who says, let's cut ETS for gas-fired power plants now.
This is exactly the wrong moment to try to undermine the emissions trading system, which has proved itself as an effective driver of decarbonisation, because it sets a very clear incentive for all actors, both businesses and households, to invest in energy efficiency and in electrification. It also provides revenues to governments to invest in the grid and the other infrastructure to make the transition to renewables. The ETS has proven itself to be an effective market mechanism, which reduces the need for state subsidies to incentivize the shift to renewables. And it sets a very clear framework that allows the right incentives to move towards electrification over both the short and the long term. I think the big problem with all of the policy flip-flops and attacks on things like the ETS is it distracts attention from other drivers of high energy prices. So there's, of course, global prices, the way that electricity prices in particular are so much affected by the gas price because of marginal pricing. But the emissions trading system is also an important way to send the signal to clean energy investors that there's going to be a market for clean energy because carbon is effectively priced. It's a polluters pays principle that those who emit carbon have to pay the price. And to extend free emissions to them would not give them an incentive to invest in the energy transition. It also distracts from the market distorting effects of untargeted energy subsidies, which are still used by a lot of EU member states and which are very expensive. Overall, Europe spends about 100 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies of different kinds. That's a lot of taxpayers' money that could be spent instead on expanding grids and installing interconnectors and all of the other infrastructure that would help also moving towards electric vehicles and heat pumps in domestic heating as well. So the emissions trading system is really the right incentive to set and gives a clear policy direction that allows investment both by individuals and also by companies.
This is all very true when it comes to the energy sector, but I think 2026 is the year of the ETS review, whether it's a crisis or not. It was designed that way. We were supposed to make the ETS more effective as we strive towards more ambitious climate targets. So maybe this is also the year, considering the atmosphere that we have, the political atmosphere that we have now found ourselves in, a moment for a reality check when it comes to the scope of the ETS system. Because when we talk about the impact of ETS on the energy sector and energy-intensive industries, especially those that do not have ready-made recipes for decarbonization like cement or steel to some extent, those are very different stories. Maybe it's time to kind of separate the conversation on the ETS into ETS for energy and ETS for industry, because they are quite different stories, quite different impacts.
There are certainly a lot of different policy issues involved in revision of the ETS. Application of the ETS to downstream products, for example, for chemicals, is a difficult and contentious subject. But what's really key is to maintain the system as a means of pricing carbon emissions. That's really the key, because that creates a market incentive for companies to invest in decarbonisation, and it brings money into renewables. And without that signal, you're essentially spending money on importing fossil fuels simply to be burnt, rather than building a clean energy system, which in the future will provide both energy independence and much cheaper energy for Europe. So it's really burning money to continue with fossil fuel subsidies and to allow free allowances to continue in sectors where technologies are available, which they can move towards, where they could electrify and they could get out of fossil fuels. So I think that's the key thing. It's ensuring that the whole market, that all of the market operators understand the transition is happening, rather than stopping and starting and flipping and flopping.
You know, many political leaders in the EU would say to that, well, that's great. We want to keep the transition going, but we need short-term measures to ease the burden on the industry, to increase competitiveness, and so on and so on. We hear this basically every day for 2 years now? What would you say to them? What are those short-term measures that do not distort the signals that lead us to independence from fossil fuels, and yet allow European companies to grow, especially because we suddenly realized we need our industry after all?
There are some very clear do's and don'ts in how to respond short-term to the crisis. Don't suppress prices. Because if you have untargeted energy subsidies, it doesn't drive efficiency, it doesn't reduce demand, and what it does do is to deter investment in renewable energy. The price signal needs to be there, it needs to be maintained, and using public money to cushion the effects is wasting taxpayers' money that could be spent on transforming the system. What does make sense, the do's for governments, would be to decrease demand, especially for gas, including from households, because we need to refill gas storage for next winter. So we're now in the spring in Europe. This is the moment to decrease demand across the economy and get the gas storage filled, but without driving up prices further. We saw after 2022 the major savings that happened in terms of gas usage by industry and also by households. It's clearly possible to do that. So that needs to happen again. Another do is to accelerate the technologies to replace gas, to encourage, and this is where state subsidies really are worth putting in, encourage the installation of heat pumps by households and commercial buildings, to invest in solar photovoltaic so that we can capture the particularly rooftop solar, to switch fuels. to move out of gas and more into electricity. These are things that governments can encourage through subsidies. But if they just go for untargeted energy subsidies, that will essentially reward the laggards in the energy transition, those who've pulled behind, and it will punish the leading companies that have invested technology. It's also unfair socially, because essentially those who have more money will be able to continue consuming more expensive fossil fuels, and the poorer households will lose out.
You say untargeted, and what about targeted? Perhaps there is a way to design state aid in such a way that it brings money to those who most need it. I feel that the signal, the vibe from Brussels is that, well, just give some state aid, and just throw money at the problem. Do you think that maybe there's no other way, but maybe there is?
Government attempts to cushion the impact on industry and on households can be well targeted in terms of households, focusing on the poorer households, because they are the ones who need help both with immediate energy bills, but also they're the ones who need the most help with investments in their housing, for example, for insulation, so that they use less fuel next winter. And they're the ones who are often the most dependent on the older cars, for example, which are less fuel efficient. So helping them to move towards electric vehicles, but also public transport and so on. It's also possible to target subsidies better towards industry by rewarding those who are investing in clean tech. That's really the way to go with it. When you look at electricity prices across Europe, member states vary a lot among the EU 27 in how well they target the subsidies. Some of them still have very untargeted subsidies, and they also add a lot to the price of fuel by the fees and levies at national level. In most member states, those add more to the bills, the pricing of carbon under the emissions trading scheme.
Let's move to a longer-term perspective for a second. When we started talking about competitiveness in Europe, we had Draghi's report, Letters report, the Clean Industrial Deal. There was a lot of talk about the US, China, and Europe being in competition, and Europe losing to the US and China. And then there was dialogue between the EU and Washington when it comes to fossil fuels, when it comes to climate policy, and so on. How do you see that scene shifting now that there's a war raging in the Middle East in terms of the stakes that the US and China see in Europe going forward?
There's a predominant narrative that you hear in a lot of European politics that climate policy is Europe's gift to the world. It's European philanthropy, where we hobble our industries with climate policies and lose competitiveness in order to save a few % of global greenhouse gas emissions. This is a false narrative, because in practice, moving to clean energy and decarbonizing our economy is bringing us energy independence and much more economic security. So decarbonization not only reduces the greenhouse gas emissions, but it also massively reduces our energy costs. And that's the only way we're going to be able to remain competitive when energy prices in the US are so much lower. And also when China has invested so much more in renewables. China has had a long-term strategy, both of decarbonizing its own economy while continuing to grow at a high rate, and also developing clean tech that it can sell to the rest of the world. And now China is the one benefiting enormously from crisis in the Middle East, because they can sell more of their electric vehicles in, for example, Brazil and India, whereas the European car makers did not make the investments that would give them cost-effective vehicles that they could compete with the Chinese on. And also, China is able to sell its solar panels and heat pumps and electrolyzers and other things that it has developed, and where it has a real manufacturing edge to all of the countries, not only European countries, but all of the countries that now want to reduce their energy prices from fossil fuels. So China really cleans up from this. They're going to do very well because they've had a long-term strategy which they've stuck to very consistently. It's the flip-flopping of policy and the wrong incentives for investment in renewables and in clean tech in Europe that I think are really the reason why we've fallen behind in this.
What's your view on the ETS2? What is your perspective on inclusion of individual consumers of fossil fuels into the emissions trading system? It proved effective in Northern Europe, but it is very, very, very controversial here in Europe and in the region.
So the emissions trading system 2 is supposed to extend it to buildings and transport. So that means housing, and it also means cars. And so by extending it to those sectors, it would decarbonize much more of the European economy. And the reason why it's controversial is because of fears of a short-term increase in prices, because you would then have the carbon emissions of domestic heating and transport emissions. That would be an additional cost. But if you think about it, not even over the long term, but over the medium term, those fossil fuel prices are going to remain high. Oil has gone from $60 a barrel to $100 a barrel. That adds another 100 billion euros to the price of oil for 2026 in Europe. So it's going to be much more expensive to drive your car on petrol in any case. And adding a carbon price to it in order to fund decarbonization, to invest in electric vehicle charging networks, to invest in public transport so that people don't have to drive, for example, an old diesel vehicle to work. Those are going to bring benefits in a few years. It's not something that is very long term.
So success depends really on what do we do with the money.
Success depends on what we do with the money. And that's where the revenues from the emissions trading scheme are absolutely vital. If governments use those revenues simply as part of their general budgets, or even worse, to subsidize fossil fuels, then you don't incentivize the transition. But if you use them to subsidize, for example, insulation of housing, so that will take down fuel bills immediately. And if you use it to incentivize moving to electricity as the main means of providing heating and cooking and so on, through heat pumps and other technologies, then that's going to bring down bills as well. We have to face the fact that we are a resource-poor continent in Europe. We don't have fossil fuels to draw on. We don't have the option of drill, baby, drill. What we have are systems that are still very dependent on fossil fuels. We have to change the system, and that's what the ETS revenues can do.
Here in Poland, we often say that there are many ways to decarbonize. There are many paths that you can take towards emissions reduction. My feeling today, after so many conversations I've already had, is that views are really shifting on which technologies are the most efficient. Like, where should we put that money? What should we incentivize? What is your view on that? What is your favorite clean technology that really has the potential to find demand, basically, and really become part of the European economy?
There are many different technologies that have proven their worth and which are already installed. For example, solar and wind, which have already driven down prices dramatically and provided more energy security in member states of the EU, such as Spain. Since 2019, for example, Spain's its dependency on gas from 75% to only 15% this year, and that's brought electricity prices down greatly. So these are clearly proven technologies. There are also technologies that have the potential in the future but aren't proven yet. One of them would be carbon capture and storage. We don't have scalable technology. The only really large-scale proven technology for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is photosynthesis by plants and the ocean. The ocean absorbs CO2 and plants absorb CO2. But all of the other technologies are not at scale. They're extremely expensive. So clearly there's a need for investment in innovation. But what we've got to do very urgently in Europe is to invest in what would drive down emissions from fossil fuels, which are essentially the largest emissions at the moment. And also we need to look at new technologies in agriculture, because agriculture is the other big source of emissions in Europe, which is hardly touched by climate policies so far. So there is a lot that can be invested in, but we need to look at it across the economy and not treat it as something that we'll do when the current crisis has passed. That always happens. Well, we'll deal with climate after we've got over the global financial crisis. We'll deal with climate after we've got over the migration crisis. We'll deal with climate after we've got over the crisis with Russia invading Ukraine, over COVID, and of course now over the crisis in the Middle East. No, each of these crises brings more problems to do with our fossil fuel dependency.
So who's responsible for that? We have short-term actions, mid-term actions, and long-term actions to take. Is it the role of member states? Is it the role of the private sector? We keep hearing about private capital not being used enough. Or is it the role of the EU and EU institutions to drive those investments forward?
There's a need for a lot more coordination at EU level. At the moment, energy planning, for example, grid planning, is largely done at national level. And clearly it's going to be more efficient if we have electricity grids that can go across national borders so that countries can balance their energy supply and demand when it's windy in one part of the continent and not in another, when it's sunny in one part of the continent and not another. Those grids and interconnectors need to be much better coordinated in terms of planning, and that will help to drive more investment as well. There needs to be more data, and there needs to be more thinking about the whole European energy system, not just a series of national systems.
And with this, we are wrapping up. I was happy to be joined by Ms. Heather Grabbe, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm at the Warsaw European Conversation, and I am joined by Byford TSANG, Senior Policy Fellow and Asia Program Director at the ECFR. Welcome.
Welcome.
Happy to have you. Mr. TSANG, I'd like to discuss the energy and climate policy of China briefly. We will get the chance to dive deeper during the panel, but just an interesting, maybe a funny story that happened to me a few weeks ago to kick us off. I was in a conversation with a representative of a Chinese clean tech company, and they were telling me about what they are offering here in Europe. And at some point, this person asked me, have you ever been to China? So I said, no. And then they said, well, then you do not get it. You do not get what we have done in China, what we are bringing to Europe, what we are offering here, and what it is that we are trying to achieve. So I was thinking, perhaps you could tell me what it is that China has done to date on its way to becoming an electrostate, because as I understand, this is the overarching goal and the strategic direction that China has taken.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be in Warsaw having these conversations. When we talk about electrostates, I would say there are actually two elements of it. So you can look at it from a supply side angle, you can look at it from a demand side angle. And from a supply side angle, I think as we all know, like China is now a dominant player in clean technologies. In the world, it dominates upstream, downstream of solar, wind, batteries, electrolyzer, you name it, a supply chain. And that is because of years of support, patience, business competition, training, competence, R&D. We talked a lot about, in Europe, like China's subsidies on these sectors that led to this, what some call now overcapacity of clean tech.
Especially solar.
Especially solar, and especially the fact that Europe was once a leader in this space. But it's more than just subsidies. So it's a wide range of policies. That includes preferential finance, that includes free land, that includes training, talent.
And an incredibly strong strategic signal. This is very interesting for Poland because there is a chronic lack of strategies in the energy sector, while China has a very strong one.
Yes, indeed. And the fact that there's also strategic patience in China. So if we look at how Europe has done its climate target and clean tech industry, Europe has set out very ambitious climate targets with the European Green Deal, with the carbon neutrality target. And then we start thinking about how we use clean tech to drive our economic growth, to become ahead in industrial competitiveness. But if we look at China, it's kind of the other way around in the logic. So if we look at China's long-term plans, policy plans, 5-year plans, if we just zoom in on the electric vehicle sectors, which now we are all talking about in Europe because now they are starting to arrive in Europe, that like the actual policy started in 2012 when you see this phrase, car superpower, popping up in policy documents. China wants to be a car or automotive superpower at a certain point in the future because they see that it's a strategic advantage for its industrial strength. So, and then we see that in 2015, there is the famous Made in China 2025 plan that freaked the US and Europe out a little bit with a lot of targets for China to become the dominant player in a lot of strategic sectors, including in clean technologies and electric vehicles. And then you see China set a target for it to have companies that will be the top 5 players in the electric vehicles or the vehicle sectors by 2025. So that was the target. And we all know that the target has been achieved. Now, China has some of the biggest automotive companies in the world. But my point here being, like, I mean, I can go on and on about these policies that from a decade ago. But my point is, China a lot of these clean tech developments that we are seeing now today is a result of strategic patience, but also on long-term industrial policy that was set a decade ago. And it was then followed by climate policies. All the policies that I talked about were there before the Paris Agreement was signed, before China set a carbon neutrality target. So I would say the kind of policy rationale in China and Europe is kind of different. Like for China, it's industrial policy first, like national power first, national security first, and climate is there, but it's kind of like a secondary consideration.
So since you mentioned climate, China has actually announced their new NDC, so nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, last year before COP30 in Brazil. And some said that it was rather underwhelming, even though China, for the first time, I will let you do the honors to present some details. China has for the first time announced some sort of absolute emissions reduction target, which for me was, after all, groundbreaking, considering the climate, so to say, or the atmosphere surrounding COP30 and climate policy globally and climate diplomacy and Paris Agreement. Do you agree? Is it underwhelming? Does it match the progress that China has made with regard to clean tech industries and its capacity to deliver emissions reduction?
Yeah, I would say the target is inadequate based on the current trends that we are observing in China. If we look at the clean energy deployment target that it has set for solar and wind, which is 6 times by 2030 of today's deployment.
Completely bonkers numbers.
Completely bonkers numbers, already mind-boggling numbers. But if we take a straight line of the past trends in the past 5 years, that would be much more. That would be 10 times the installment of solar and wind by the time that the NDC target is reached. And same for EVs, like China has already, but now 50% of the cars sold in China are electric vehicles as of 2025. And that has already exceeded their own target that was set in 2025. So a lot of these targets, yes, obviously the groundbreaking is the first time that China has set what we would call an absolute kind of reduction target, because they have said that they are going to start reducing emission at an unspecified date in time. So it's the first time that they're signaling the emissions will go down, but it doesn't specify the time of the peak. But it in itself, in a codified document at the UN, is groundbreaking. And also the fact that I would say the politics and the global situation that we're surrounded with makes this target even more significant, because it was announced the day after Donald Trump said that climate, again, is a hoax and is pointless to stay in the Paris Agreement.
And it was announced by Xi Jinping himself.
And that, I would say, is the point. I think that signals that there is still, despite we said that like climate target is underwhelming, like it's inadequate, it is still at the top of the political agenda. China sees that, well, not only as a soft power, that being a climate leader, doing good in the world, providing the technology, what they call public goods for the world, but at the same time, as I said, the technology itself, the supply side of the electoral state, is an industrial strength. And obviously now we're talking about the trade tensions that it might entail in Europe, but Europe is also talking about how we want to have a more secure energy system, and renewable energy is definitely part of it, and China will have to be part of the system, but the issue is like how much of it should be.
So a quick yes or no question, with all of the limitations of a yes or no questions. Is China the climate champion of the world right now, as of 2026?
China is a clean technology leader, a climate leader, so yes, in that sense, but I would disagree with the word champion, because we in Europe a lot of times think that we are obviously very advanced in our climate policy, and we have a whole kind of diplomacy surrounding climate. Right? We have climate envoys, we have climate diplomacy, we try to support development of clean technologies, we want to spread our emissions trading systems in the world. But I would say that China is not in that way a champion of policies or having more ambitious target, because Europe's kind of climate diplomacy is centered around the rationale that like Europe has the solutions, have the policy solutions, in particular the emission standards, the emission trading system. And also with some clean technologies, we still have world-leading wind turbine manufacturers in Europe. So we have the technologies and the solution. And if we can provide that through technical assistance or grants or loans to these countries, then we can get them to become more ambitious in their climate. So I would say in that way, that is how Europe sees kind of climate championship. And I would say that China, in a way, is not in a champion position, but what it's doing is, again, it's a different logic. It's trying to scale up clean technologies. It's bringing the cost down. It's allowing the world to adopt these technologies. So in a way, China is promoting itself as a provider of an enabler, but not necessarily kind of championing for greater or faster climate action in that way.
I'm happy you mentioned it because that next question actually concerns exactly that. And it is a what if question. What if China is perhaps underperforming at home when it comes to deploying renewables and advancing emissions reductions because a large chunk of its clean tech sector is designed for exports? Maybe it is Europe that China looks at most focusedly when it's pushing forward its industrial policy in clean tech.
Like I said, I don't see that, but despite the policy targets on climate or on deployment of clean technologies is underwhelming, but the fact that it's laser focused on building its clean tech sector and driving down costs and having it as a driver of economic growth. So that is set in policy speeches by President Xi, that is set in the 5-year plan, that is set in all the policy documents from the Energy Administration. So that is not going to change. The worry that I have is that despite that China is enabling the world to transition with its technologies, the fact that it is not transitioning fast enough poses a global problem because climate change is a global problem after all, and China accounts for 25 to 30% of global emissions. It's the largest emitter in the world. If we look at emissions in just the past decade, since the signature of the Paris Agreement, 90% of the emissions increase in the world is driven by China. So how quickly it decides to reduce emissions, first, make or break the Paris Agreement to keep global temperature within 1.5 degrees. But second of all is that it would have actual impact globally in terms of extreme weather, in terms of drought, in terms of floods, in terms of extreme weather. I think that is, for me, is the biggest worry. I think that it's great that China is enabling that transition, but the speed at which it transitions its own power system, which is still 51% of total primary energy consumption, is still based on coal. So as we talk about China being an electoral state, there is this tension going on because the fact that China is having all these transition, but at the same time also building coal and also having coal as like a backbone of its electricity system sometimes is contradictory. So I think that is the tension that is not only going to have an impact on China's own transition, but then also on global climate.
Let's move closer to Europe for a second. Europe has been trying for a few years now to become more independent of China when it comes to clean tech. It is trying to grow its own clean tech industries, or at least support those which have organically become strong, like the wind industry. And it is trying to, at the very least, know and monitor the influence that China has on Europe's economy through clean tech, and at best to curb it. Do you think that these efforts will be successful, or is it just still possible for China to bring down prices even more to make the choice rather obvious and make European companies equipment Chinese tech?
Yeah, I believe Europe has come a long way in the last 5 years in terms of rethinking its energy security approach, kicked off by Russia invasion of Ukraine, that has led to rethinking on dependency on Russia, but at the same time, general dependency on its energy system. So we see that since 2022, there's a raft of measures from the European Commission, including Net Zero Industry Act, Critical Raw Mineral Acts, that is aimed to reduce dependency. I think one of the core questions that Europe didn't answer in, I would say, the last period of time is the fact that, like you said, because China will continue to drive down costs, there will continue to be innovation from China. So how do we compete with China on cost and on the technology itself? Europe has tried to put on tariffs on EVs. it's kind of slowed down the EVs flows from China a little bit, so giving a little bit of breathing space of European manufacturers. But then we saw that there is a flood of plug-in hybrids from China, like the numbers skyrocketed, like imports from China of plug-in hybrids. Also very advanced connected vehicles from China that skyrocketed to Europe. So I think it's right that especially the issues that we're facing today with the Strait of Hormuz and the volatility in the fossil fuel market, we need to rethink choke points and dependency in our energy systems. But so the goal that has set out has been right, but the problem that we have been facing, we did not do well, is how do we address the cost question? How do we address the fact that there will still be competition from China, but at the same time, we want to diversify. If we ask our companies to source from local suppliers or more trusted suppliers, then unless we don't have the competition from China, then it would not work because you will still be competing with Chinese low-cost manufacturer imports. So I think what the Commission is doing now with the Industrial Accelerator Act is plugging this hole, which is the fact that we require government subsidies and incentive schemes only to be eligible for domestically produced components, clean technologies, which would give the Chinese an incentive to, or anyone that has an incentive to access this scheme to set up manufacturing in Europe, that would be able to protect the jobs in Europe, at the same time level the playing field for ones that are willing to invest here in Europe. And you don't have to put in tariffs in a way that is one sector after another, and then you have to chase the different sectors.
Let us wrap up with a view from China. If you think about the Chinese looking at developments in Europe and their own plans and compare the two, what do you think would constitute a success from China's perspective, let's say in 2030, with regard to economic relations with Europe, especially in the energy and clean tech sectors?
I would say that success would definitely start with energy security. I think that is the main, or security generally from the Chinese side. So that means that it will continue to drive deployment of renewable technologies that reduce dependency on external energy sources. I would believe that success would mean that China would be able to access part of the European clean technology market. Is going to be increasingly hard because as we are seeing that in Germany, in Lithuania, and now in the UK, there are certain government considerations of not allowing Chinese technologies into, specifically in the wind technology sectors in this case, because of cybersecurity concerns from these technologies. So China would have to navigate that, thinking about what are the kind of the core technology and the less sensitive technology that it will still be able to engage Europe with on this front. So I think having that access would be important. But what I would also think China would see as success is also that a lot of the European companies in the clean technology sectors or in electric vehicles, the automotive companies, they are global companies. They are competing globally for market shares. We are already seeing that Chinese clean tech companies are unseating a lot of the European incumbents in markets like Brazil, in markets like Thailand, in India. If we look at the wind industry, Chinese wind is now 40% of the wind market, whereas it was 40% for European wind manufacturers just 5 years ago. So I think China would continue because cost is going to go down. The transition is going to continue with the rest of the world, especially now supercharged with the energy volatility in the fossil market. So China will be focusing on gaining market share on this clean technologies industry. So I think the question for Europe is that how do we respond to that, working together with these trading partners to think of a way to scale up market in a way that is have a European supplies and component in that, and also think about diversifying supply chains with these partners. That is not directly aimed at China, I would say, but I think having more diversified supply chain is going to make the global energy supply chains and system much more safe and secure.
Thank you very much. Byford TSANG, Senior Policy Fellow at the ECFR, in the margins of the Warsaw European Conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us. We invite you to listen to all 5 special episodes of the Polityka Insight podcast recorded at the Warsaw European Conversation 2026.